I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet tonight, both past and present. My name is Charlie Shandil, and I'm one of the Executive Council members here at the Australian Institute for International Affairs, Queensland. Well, welcome to you all tonight in this in-person event. It's quite rare to have these, right? Oh, sorry, is it
And people on the Zoom.
of course, yeah, the people on the Zoom as well. That's right. Have to add that bit in these days. Right? We have a sellout event tonight, which is great, and we have a couple of hundred people online as well, which I think is a huge turnout. We're delighted tonight to have Mr. Peter Varghese, AO, to discuss Australia and the shifts in the Indo-Pacific, where he'll focus on the strategic and economic currents in the broader Indo-Pacific region. Before I pass it over to Peter, let me give you a brief introduction about it. As many of you know, Peter reached the highest echelons of the Australian Public Service in a distinguished 38-year career, where he became the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade before his most recent appointment as the Chancellor of the University of Queensland. But what many of you might not know is that Peter never set out to be a public servant. He previously coined himself an accidental public servant. And just like the discovery of penicillin, it's a great accident. In his public service career, in addition to being secretary, Peter held some of the highest senior appointments in the Australian Public Service, including the High Commissioner to India, the High Commissioner to Malaysia, Director General of the Office of National Assessments, and Senior Advisor International to Prime Minister John. Following his retirement from the public service, Peter was appointed by Prime Minister Turnbull to develop the India Economic Strategy to 2035, an ambitious strategy to transform Australia's relationship with India. So Peter's no stranger to writing big documents. He was the head of the White Paper Secretariat, which drafted Australia's first White Paper on Foreign and Trade Policy. Peter was also a speechwriter for former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, a job he likens to being a food taster for a glutton. Over my own career in the public service, I've had the pleasure of learning from Peter on not just foreign policy, but leadership capacity in the role of public service today. His notion of radical incrementalism and a shift away from short-termism, all with a focus of speaking truth to power, are just some areas which offer insight into Peter's leadership style and leadership capacity. Very few public servants have seen what Peter's seen, experiencing some of the highest and also some of the lowest moments in our foreign policy and international relations. They say you learn a lot about Australia and the mechanics of Australia from a public servant, as long as you can get them to talk about it. What I've come to realize is that you learn the most from a retired public servant, because they are able to offer you the untarnished reality of bureaucracy. I'm sure we're going to be in for an exceptional discussion tonight. Please join me in welcoming Peter Varghese.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie, and good evening to all of you. It must be a slow evening in Brisbane to have a good turnout. Accident and luck. There's many theses that can be written about the role of accident and luck in life and careers, but I won't go into that. Let me start by thanking the Queensland chapter of AIIA for the opportunity to speak this evening and to commend the work the chapter and indeed the national organisation does. And it's an organisation that's been around for a very long time, with that very noble purpose of promoting a more informed understanding of Australian foreign policy. And there's no more important time to have an informed understanding of Australian foreign policy than these days. My remarks tonight will be very much personal comments and reflections. So I'm not speaking on behalf of any of the institutions that I'm affiliated with, whether it's the University of Queensland, Asialink, of which I'm chair. It's the conceit, I think, of every generation that they are dealing with absolutely unique and unparalleled challenges. But you can kind of forgive that assumption if you look around the international environment at the moment, because I think we are in many ways, to adapt a phrase of the late Tom Wolfe, witnessing a bonfire of certainties. So many of the supporting pillars of our international system, I think, are under very deep structural stress. And I want to cover some of that in my remarks this evening. I want to sort of put a couple of propositions to you, and then I'll try and elaborate and justify them. The first is that we may not succeed in this endeavour, but our highest foreign policy priority, in my view, is to try and prevent a new Cold War between the United States and China and all that goes with it. Secondly, that if we are to have any chance of avoiding a new Cold War, I think we need to construct a new strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific, which both engages China and constrains China. Develop that idea a little bit in the course of my remarks. Thirdly, that the Quad is, in my view, an increasingly significant element in constraining China, but that it's also a case of same bent, different dreams amongst the four nations of the Quad. Fourthly, that India is going to become a much more significant partner to Australia, not just in the Quad, but it is always going to march to its own tune. And India's capacity to be a significant strategic player will ultimately turn on whether it has the economic heft to become a shaper of our regional environment. And that in turn turn on what I can only describe as the fluctuating appetite for economic reforms in the Indian political system. And the last point I want to make, and I'll do it in probably starker terms than reality, is that I think Australia is in danger of mistaking an attitude for a policy. We have very distinctive interests to protect in an increasingly multipolar region, and that requires quite a nuanced understanding of our neighbourhood and the broader Indo-Pacific. So let me start with China. These days, everything starts and ends with China, actually. So engaging China is, in my view, a necessary policy, but it is no longer a sufficient framework for dealing with China. I mean, if you look back over the last 4 decades, from Deng Xiaoping's opening up the Chinese economy in the late 70s, through to the global financial crisis in 2008, those were the salad days of Australian economic and strategic interests, because they were the days when we could have our cake and eat it, by which I mean we benefited from China's remarkable economic growth, and we weren't paying the strategic price, not one that we could really see in that period. So we had economic opportunity and strategic stability. Foreign policy is in business, economic opportunity and strategic stability is about as good as it gets. Now, all of that, in my view, has changed, and it's changed largely because China's own intentions have, if not changed, certainly become more evident and more clearly articulated. And if you ask me, what does China want? My short answer is it essentially wants to recreate the Middle Kingdom. And by that, I mean China wants a world where hierarchy is harmony. China is at the top of the hierarchy, and other states are expected to preemptively concede the supremacy of China's interests in all the cases that matter to China. Now, the Middle Kingdom didn't quite operate that way, because I don't think there was that degree of kowtowing to China as we've become accustomed to talking about. But that's essentially, in my view, what China wants. Now, it's quite important, I think, to be pretty clear from an Australian perspective what that ambition represents. So, for instance, does it make China an enemy? Does it make China an adversary? Does it make China a strategic competitor? All three descriptions of which you will find running through US policy discussions about China. The short answer is that China is not an enemy in the classic sense of an enemy, in that I don't think China has designs on Australian territory, is a classically expansionist power, although it has a very expansive view of where China's territory begins and ends. And you only have to look at the South China Sea, Taiwan, 9-dash line to get a feel for that expansive view. But China is not the Soviet Union in terms of expansionism. It's not even Nazi Germany in terms of Lebensraum. It is, as I say, wanting to re-establish that middle kingdom. China is certainly a strategic competitor of the United States, but that doesn't automatically make it a strategic competitor of Australia. And indeed, we're in a different league. So if it were a competition, I think the result would be quite clear. Nor is China, in my view, an existential ideological threat to democracies. And I think this is an issue which doesn't get enough attention in a public debate. And there's too much assumption built into it. So China wants to make the world safe for autocracy, in my view, by which I mean China wants to ensure that its authoritarian political character is in no way constrained or qualified by the international system. That's the sense in which it wants to make the world safe for autocracy. But I don't think China has a driving ambition to reverse the tide of democracy internationally, or has a cunning plan to turn democratic countries such as Australia into one-party authoritarian systems. Does that mean China has no ideology? Far from it. I think it is a deeply ideological system. But its ideology is related much more to the role of the party and the reinforcement of the party's claim to a monopoly of political power. So Chinese ideology is more about how the party has stood up for China, how the party is reversing a century of humiliation, how the party has created wealth for China, and how the party in the next phase will create power to go with the wealth. That is a very different ideological drive to what we experienced in the Cold War under the Soviet Union. So why do I say engage and constrain? Well, engaging China is kind of obvious. For Australia, we benefit from engaging China economically, notwithstanding the economic sanctions that have been imposed on Australia. The benefits we've had from the growth of the Chinese economy over the last two to three decades have been significant. The nature of the global challenges that we face, whether it's climate change, which is currently very topical, or proliferation, or pandemics, all of those are in a category that requires a measure of global cooperation. And if you're looking for global cooperation, we can't exclude China. So the case for engagement is fairly straightforward. The case for constraining China is a little bit more nuanced, in my view. There is a very distracting debate about who is going to prevail between the US and China. And a lot of policy that is being built or entertained around a judgment on what that outcome will be. I'm a complete agnostic on the question of whether China will overtake the United States to become the single largest country, or the single most powerful country in the world. It may happen, it may not happen. The US has enormous advantages, enormous capability, enormous depth, enormous resilience, and you write off the US, I think, at your peril. China, on the other hand, has enormous challenges. There's a brittleness at the heart of the Chinese system. And the contrast between a policy of turning your back on economic reform, which is essentially what Xi Jinping is doing, and maintaining the monopoly power of the Communist Party is going to become much more difficult to keep in balance. So I think China has deep structural challenges. The compact, if you can call it a compact, between the party and the people in China, it's a compact that's never been tested, by the way, by any popular expression, is that we deliver economic growth and you accept our monopoly on political power. Now, if you at the same time decide to pursue an economic policy which is going to make your economic growth slow, which is going to prevent you from making the structural reforms that you need to shift China into a genuinely market economy, you don't have to be sort of Nostradamus to work out that at some point that compact is going to come under intolerant strain. And if you add to that the demographic challenges on China and the sheer difficulty of managing a country of that size, you can see that this idea that you just project into the future the trajectory of economic growth of the past, in my mind, leaves much to be desired. So how do you deal with a China with high ambitions, which may or may not overtake the United States? Well, in my view, the best way to deal with it is to have a collective capacity to constrain China's behavior. So while I don't know whether China is going to be more powerful than the United States, there is one thing I do know for sure, and that is that China cannot be more powerful than the United States, Japan, India, Australia, plus any other country you want to add to that mix. And that is, I think, the big strategic challenge for a generation to come, which is how do you put together a mechanism that has the capacity both to engage China, but also to constrain China, to signal to China that leverage is a two-way street, and also to signal that there will be a price to pay if red lines are crossed. Now, we're a long way from actually arriving at such a mechanism, but that is the direction in which the Quad is heading, and that is the sort of strategic rationale, if you like, for the Quad. Now, I said the Quad was same bed, different dream. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think each member of the Quad is looking for different things out of the Quad. For the United States, it's a relatively straightforward proposition. The United States is determined to hang on to its strategic primacy. It's determined to hang on to its strategic predominance, and it will not accept a peer competitor. And so for the US, how you prevent a peer competitor from overtaking you is the big strategic challenge. For Japan and India, their perspective is the perspective of a neighboring country, which is uneasy with the idea of this huge economy and strategic power breathing down their neck next door. So for them, China's Middle Kingdom ambitions means a constraining of their strategic options, and it means that their ability to maneuver the international environment and regional environment for their own interests is severely restricted simply by the heft and the size of Chinese power. Australia, in my view, has a slightly different approach, although I don't think we ever articulate it this way, and not all Australian policy thinkers even conceive of it this way. And that is that Australia, when you think about it, is actually the only member of the Quad whose fundamental objection to China is the political character of the Chinese system. You see, the US will oppose any country seeking to displace it from its perch as the predominant. Japan and India aren't really concerned with the authoritarian character of the Chinese system. They're concerned about this huge, great neighboring power constricting its room for maneuver. Whereas for Australia, when you think about it, if China were a liberal democracy and proceeded to become the predominant power in the world because its economy grew at a much faster rate than the US and its strategic weight, we would not have much of a basis on which to object to that if it were a liberal democracy, unless you wanted to bring up questions of race and some other criteria for opposing China's position. So for us, this is as much a question of values as it is of strategic interests. And that's something we should keep firmly in mind. Now, Japan and India, I think, will make different contributions to this longer-term project of constraining China. Japan will become, in my view, a more significant strategic player. It will invest more in its strategic capability. It will no longer be content to contract out its strategic policy to the United States, but it will remain a firm ally of the US unless it comes to the conclusion that the United States can no longer be relied on to retain its commitment to the region or to retain its commitment to leadership in Asia. And I don't see that happening anytime soon in the case of China. And the more powerful and the more difficult and the more assertive China becomes, I think the more Japan will find comfort in the US alliance. That is, until, if it ever does, reach the conclusion that relationship wouldn't deliver what it was. India has a very different perspective. India is a great believer in strategic autonomy. It will always march to its own strategic tune. It may be reinterpreting non-alignment, which was its foundational principle, but it is still very much a country that sees its future as not aligned in an alliance sense to any other power, and which finds virtue in freedom of strategic movement. So India is a country that will always want to keep its options open, rarely exercise an option because its objective is to keep as much strategic growth as possible. So people who look at the relationship between the US and India, or Japan and India, or Australia and India, and see a relationship which is getting closer and closer from a geopolitical point of view, they're correct, but they're correct only up to a point, because there will be a point beyond which India will not be prepared to go, and that is really the point at which it has to entertain the idea of an alliance relationship and all of the obligations that go with an alliance relationship. So India will be one of those countries that seeks to have strong relationships with a whole range of countries. In some ways, it'll be a promiscuous strategic power. It has a very close relationship with Russia. It has a very close relationship with Iran. And these are not countries that naturally appeal to those of us who consider themselves part of the old sort of Western alliance. But to think otherwise about India, I think, is to be a little bit naive. Now, I said that India's strategic heft will depend virtually completely on its economic heft. And it's the case with all strategic powers. I mean, if you don't have an economic base to your strategic position, there's not much that you can actually achieve. And so the big question for India is, how far is it prepared to go to put its economy on a high growth, sustainable trajectory? Now, India will grow as an economy virtually irrespective of what its policy settings are, because it's got some strong structural drivers. Well, it's got scale to begin with, and you can't discount scale. In fact, you know, the Industrial Revolution made scale redundant. That's why the British were able to succeed in the way that they were, with a very small, relatively small population, but an industrial base which gave them real power and which enabled them to surpass countries like China and India, which had a much, much bigger population. What we're seeing now is a revert to the historical norm, where scale is a strategic value in and of itself. And scale married to the right economic policies is an unbeatable combination. You're seeing that in China, and we may or may not see it in India. I mean, I'm a long-term optimist in India because I think India will, it may be a bit like a tortoise and a hare, but I think India will eventually get there. But, you know, it's got the urbanization of the world's largest agrarian economy. It's got now a serious investment in infrastructure. It's got a demography which, if properly handled, make it a huge economic asset for India, with a mean age of about 26 or 27. And it's got institutions. And, you know, we should never underrate the significance of institutions. It's got the rule of law, even if its justice system is sometimes rather slow and takes a long time. It's comfortable operating in English. It has a very strong entrepreneurial tradition, balanced a bit by old-fashioned Fabian socialism, which I think still is the great political philosophy of most of the elite. But all that said, I think India, if it makes the decision to be serious about its economic growth, can succeed. And the signs there are positive, even if they are mixed. A couple of points about Southeast Asia. So Australia's, you know, ambition with Southeast Asia historically has always been that it would remain neutral, but lean towards the West. That was the best we could have hoped from Southeast Asia. And for most of the last few decades, that's essentially where Southeast Asia has been. Now the question is whether Southeast Asia remain neutral, but lean more towards China. I think there's no prospect of Southeast Asia aligning itself with either the US or China. It doesn't to make a choice. It's very uncomfortable if anyone puts pressure on it to make a choice. And if we put too much pressure on it to make a choice, we may be very disappointed with the choice that it makes. So Southeast Asia is one of those areas that we're going to have to invest a lot more into the future, recognizing that it doesn't have its own strategic or independent strategic weight. Although if Indonesia ends up becoming fifth or sixth largest economy, as most projections suggest, that could well change. So for Australia, Southeast Asia is important precisely because of its geography, not because of its firepower. And we need to be investing more in that. Now, there are many other parts of the region that I could talk about, but in the interest of time, I'll sort of skip over and happy to come back in Q&A. Now, I said at the outset that Australia is in danger of mistaking an attitude for a policy. And the challenge for Australia is that we are not going to be a lonely country in the sense that we're not going to be a friendless country. But we are going to have to learn to make our own way in the world more than we have up to now. And that means we have to make a much more substantial investment in our defence and in our diplomacy. In our defence, we need to rediscover the ambition to be able to defend Australia without the combat assistance of the United States. My own view is that we have claimed that to be our defence policy now going back to the 1980s, but we've never really believed it. And I think deep in their heart, most Australian governments, reflecting the scepticism of the Australian community, believe that we are unable to defend ourselves without the assistance of the United States. Now, the US can help us in many ways. It can help us through intelligence, it can help us through technology, it can help us by the sheer deterrent power of our alliance relationship, in the sense that any aggressor would have to, at the very least, calculate whether having a go at Australia would provoke the US response. So I'm not making the case for a defence policy that's detached from our alliance relationship, far from it, because I think the alliance is a force multiplier. But we need to be more prepared to work out how we defend ourselves without combat assistance from the United States. And we need to find a better balance between forward defence, which has always been a deep historical ambition for Australia, and the defence of the continent. And I think we're kind of drifting a bit back towards concepts of forward defence, of which AUKUS is probably one example. Now, AUKUS is an important agreement in that it is a leap of technology for Australia. It's going through a door which up to now has been slammed shut on the face. It's not as if Australians have never thought about nuclear submarines. I mean, it's been part of our sort of thinking about defence acquisitions and force structure for a very long time. But there was no interest, if I could sort of simplify things, from the United States in providing Australia with the technology for nuclear submarines that the AUKUS agreement now is foreshadowing. Whether it gets there is another question, but it's foreshadowing. And ultimately, I think the driver for the change in US policy is essentially looking at sorts of strategic contingencies that the US might find itself in vis-a-vis China, and the value of having, however many it is, 8, 10, 12 Australian nuclear-powered submarines being able to operate in that distant theatre of Australia in combination with the United States. Now, we have our own reasons for wanting quiet, long-range, sustainable submarines. So it's a sort of happy melding of the two. So let me, because I'm conscious I've probably spoken for a bit longer than I should have, but let me just conclude with some other observations. I think one of the kind of complications of international relations at the moment is that everywhere foreign policy is today dominated by domestic considerations. You can see it in China's wolf warrior diplomacy, which makes absolutely no sense as diplomacy. I mean, it is the most counterproductive piece of diplomacy you can possibly imagine. Its only explanation is that it plays to domestic considerations. You can see it in the foreign policy of the United States. You can see it in the foreign policy of Australia. You can see it in the foreign policy of France. Now, those of us who've worked in diplomacy for lengthy periods have always understood that domestic trumps international in just about every occasion. But there are gradations of how far a domestic political calculation would trump a careful analysis of what your national interest is. And unfortunately, in too many of our countries, that is precisely what is happening. We are pursuing policies that make absolute sense from a short-term domestic political perspective, but which run a high risk of causing longer-term or medium-term damage to our national interests. So, to go back to where I started, we all need to be thinking about how we avoid Cold War. We need to recognize what a Cold War actually means. It means, firstly, a radical decoupling of a global economy which has delivered wealth and high living standards to Australia. I mean, Australia, more than most countries, has handled the politics of globalization effectively. We have benefited from globalization, and it has been, by and large, an equitable benefit. I mean, if you chart where wages in Australia have gone over, say, the last 20 to 30 years of globalization, you will see a steady increase in our wage trajectory. It's flattened off more recently. You contrast that with the United States, where the wage increases for working class Americans haven't shifted in 20 to 30 years. If you want an explanation for Trump, look at that. And the US system, I think, is still working its way through that. So as Australians, we shouldn't underestimate what a radical decoupling of the global economy will mean for our own national wealth. And I think the other implication of a Cold War is that it can turn hot and nuclear with miscalculation. And, that is a high risk game. So while we may, at the end of the day, end up in a new Cold War, I think that should very much be a second best choice. We should be investing as much as we can on the preferred option of avoiding one and both engaging and constraining China. So Charlie, I'll end there, and very happy to pick up any of those points or other things that I haven't got to try.
Firstly, thank you. That was very exciting. I'm sure you've got the audience raring to go and ask. We've got hands up already. But if it's okay, I might ask the first question. I might take the chance to do the first question. And we also have online questions as well. Australia's had some really big wins. In the initial days of construction of the United Nations, APEC, G20 leaders, etc. Do you think that same level of ambition still multilateralism remains today? Do you think things have shifted to a point now where that ambition really is flexible? And what role do you see Australia playing in that?
So, multilateralism to succeed needs a permissive environment. And at the moment, the environment is far from this. So there's no question that from an Australian perspective, a strong multilateral system is squarely in our national interests, because we can't buy or bully our way. So we are quite dependent on the system of institutions, the system of international law that can protect the interests of countries who aren't citizens. Unfortunately, we are now in an era where the multilateral system is very much on life support. Look at the pandemic. Here is a classic example of a global problem requiring a global solution. And what did we see in practice? We saw nothing that looked anywhere like the global solution. The international institutions that were set up to try and deal with it turned out to be pretty ineffective. every government basically had a national policy with a bit of lip service to the vaccine program. So multilateralism is always captive to broader geopolitics and particularly to great power. And you saw that during the sort of height of the real conflict. And now we're seeing it, I think, as a consequence of tensions in this China relationship. And why did Xi Jinping not go to Glasgow? Probably a lot of reasons why. I suspect the main reason is that he was signaling to the United States, if you think we can cooperate with you on climate change while you run an agenda on trade and other things, which China's views against our interests, thinking Xi Jinping.
Yes, I think people in the thing are not able to hear you properly, so let me see if I can move it a bit closer. Sorry.
So none of that means Australia should abandon its high hopes and ambitions and continents. We need to find different ways of advancing our multilateral interests. And for the most part, that's going to be more along the lines of coalitions of the willing, smaller groupings that are prepared to do things without waiting for everyone to do it. So what I think is virtually dead is universal multilateralism. And by universal multilateralism, I mean the idea that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which is the founding principle of, say, the WTO. The reason we don't have a successful global trade route is that one country, whether it's Malta or take your pick on point in the history of WTO negotiations, can hold these things up. So I don't think that's a sustainable one. So we'll end up with a different type of but we shouldn't give up on the idea that we can't find a way to bring countries that have a different geopolitical view to us or different values to us into the multilateral system. Take a different type of strategy and a different type of leadership.
Let me open it up to the floor. If you could just say your name and clearly speak clearly. I think I saw this gentleman first.
Is there a microphone or mic?
Oh, sorry, this is the microphone up here. No, but no, just speak clearly. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Peter. You've very aggressively forced me to collapse 37 questions into one. So, oh, I'm sorry, David Hyman. So I think there's a strong argument to be made that the economic rise of China since could not have occurred without the international trade system laid in place post World War II and dominated by the United States. And so I wonder, if I have these numbers anywhere close to right, China imports something like 1.5 trillion US a year, exports something like 2.5 trillion on a GDP of about 16. And that's the only source of their hard currency, not including, of course, stolen IP or other forms of economic input that doesn't measure. So I wonder if the growth of Chinese Navy, a change or an attempted change in control of the sea lanes and access to control the sea lanes with the 9-line, et cetera, doesn't risk China killing the goose that laid the golden egg. And I wonder if you feel that China, in pursuing its strategic goals, thinks that price might be worth paying.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, David. I mean, there's no question that China got an easy ride on trade. Now, the Chinese achievement in historical terms is pretty dramatic. I mean, to lift 600 million people out of poverty is no small thing. But you're absolutely right. It did so off the back of an international trading system which opened opportunities which were not reciprocated and for which you didn't have to pay a price when it deviated from trade principles. In my view, China is now heading down an economic path, which makes very little sense, even from a Chinese perspective, but makes a lot of sense from a domestic political perspective. And by that I mean, it is in some ways doing more to decouple itself from the global economy than any amount of hard rhetoric on a new Cold War on the other side will do. It is pursuing policies of self-reliance. It is developing a concept of dual circulation, which at the end of the day is essentially saying we're big enough as a domestic consumption economy to achieve wealth without having to become, without having to remain a begets country. So all of those things, the departure from market principles, which were never completely embedded in the Chinese system, but they were currently moving towards, and the reassertion of state control of the economy, the reinvestment in state-owned enterprise. I mean, all of these things, for those of us who have a certain sort of belief in the value of market economy as market forces, I think are counterproductive. Now, why is China doing all of those things? I think it's ultimately a calculation of the leadership's part that if they don't go down that direction, the position of the Communist Party becomes vulnerable. So Xi Jinping, I think, overlearned the lesson of what happened in Russia. He looked at Gorbachev and Glasnost and Perestroika and said, they got that terribly wrong. They want to have doubled down on their existing policies, not opened up their politics. And so he's determined not to repeat the mistake of Gorbachev from a domestic political point of view. The international engagement. Where will it all end? Who knows? I mean, we're talking about a black box in terms of visibility, lines of sight on the domestic politics in China. Xi Jinping seems more likely than not to get his third term and perhaps subsequent terms. But there has to be also a lot of people in the Chinese system who are scratching their head at them. But you won't see it. So countries can make terrible mistakes in terms of strategic positioning. And the March of Folly, as Barbara reminds us, a lot of examples in history. And the thing about a March of Folly is that it's not proved to be folly. The point about the March of Folly is that they knew it was a folly, and yet they set out down that track. I don't know, maybe we're seeing that in China.
I got an online question next.
So there's a question on Taiwan from Christopher Skinner. There's another question on Taiwan. I'll try and combine those two, Peter. Christopher Skinner, question is, Japan's new PM has declared increased defense capability and has committed to defense of Taiwan. So how does this affect the Quad? I'll combine it with the other question from David Ritchie. He says, thanks, Peter. Does China's ambition re Taiwan have the potential to put the cat among the pigeons and upset the timeline envisaged by engage and contain?
Yeah, well, a good question. So on the first, I mean, I think Japan's position on Taiwan has been pretty clear for some time, even though it's been articulated with kind of greater forcefulness more recently. Japan, I think, was always going to be on the side of defending Taiwan if the circumstances of an attack on Taiwan was a unilateral act of forced reunification. So I'm not particularly surprised that Kishida would reinforce that view. Taiwan has the potential to get very ugly. There's no question that if we were to be facing a unilateral forced reunification of Taiwan without provocation, by which I mean in the absence of a declaration of independence by Taiwan, you are on a very, very dangerous path. And so the constrained part there might need to be even stronger than I had set out in my thinking. Do I think that Xi Jinping is going to move on Taiwan next year or two? Probably not. I noticed the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said he didn't expect it in the next 2 years. I think there's a bit of Sun Tzu psychological operations going to Taiwan. Personally, I think that it's very important that the US sends a very clear message about what the consequences might be if China was flirting a move on Taiwan. Because, if China makes the calculation they can do it because they won't meet with any resistance or any serious resistance, I think that would be a big miscalculation and a misreading where the Americans will get involved.
Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you, Pete. Great talk. The obvious question following on from that is, in your scenarios, we have a submarine, subs operating with Americans. So where do we stand if there is Chinese deciding to take over Taiwan? Is it in our strategic interest? Is it identical to the strategic interest of the United States? That's question to be answered, I guess. The second observation, very quickly, is that your view that we in Australia really want China to be a democracy. I'm not so sure many of us would really embrace that. We can see the constraints of democracy in India, for instance, where they're dealing, have to deal with sectional interests. We can see the sclerosis that's happening in the United States with democracy. It's not really delivering what it's supposed to. So it's not a good model at the moment. And I must say that if you look at Singapore as an authoritarian government, it has an extraordinarily good record. So I'm not so sure we would want to sort of lust after democracy in China. I would imagine that you would then get a whole series of sexual interests interfering with what has been not a bad transmission belt of people's wishes being translated into pretty reasonable outcomes. And sure, there's some pretty heavy sailing ahead, but I certainly want to change votes right now.
Well, Jeremy, I won't concede a moral equivalence between democracy and a one-party authoritarian system. But the point I was trying to make about Australia and China is that if China were a democracy, we would think about its aspirations to regional leadership in a different way. So that's not to say that a democratic China won't also pose different challenges. But what would be our objection to a democratic China becoming the predominant power in the region? I guess that's the question I would pose. I don't think there's a convincing answer as to why we would still be opposed to that outcome if we were dealing with a very different system and very different characters. And ultimately, there is a link between the character of the political system and its international behavior. It may not be a sort of Manichaean type thing, where one is undiluted evil and the other one is more sweetness and light. It's not as simple as that, but there is a broad connection. I think between the two. On Taiwan, well, you know, it's a mistake to think that we have identical interests in any other country. We have our own interests, some of which overlap to a considerable degree with other countries, some of which overlap to a small degree, and some of which have no point of intersection. But I would have thought we would have an interest in ensuring that a democracy of 25 people facing an act of aggression, if that is what we end up looking at from the Taiwan.
The aggression, if we agree that it's not a joke.
Well, it's a means and an end issues. I mean, this is not the heart of the province, and this is different in the sense that, sure, we have a one China policy. We don't recognize Taiwan as a state. But we have a lot of dealings with China, a lot of international dealings with China. So I don't think you can see it simply as an entitlement in word for China to just move in that direction. And the legalities of it, I think, secondly, and will be said. We have faced, God help us, we have faced that. But my hunch is that we would look for ways to help. What those ways are, I think that's where Australia probably come.
I think we have time for one last question.
Bernadette, I'm with, but representing and asking a question perspective, having spent 4 years in School of Political Science and International Studies at UQ, what do you see is the capacity of this upper generation vis-a-vis the desire to work in public service, the desire to work in DFAT, in foreign policy, kind of in light of where we are with misinformation, doesn't look quite as cool to work in government, so I'll say in Washington, D.C. for the 20s, 30s after the last 8 years. What do you see in your role, capacity, or efficiency here about the next generation being informed to come behind this generation? Because it's quite interesting. I even noticed that having attended AWI meetings, we're getting fewer and fewer PhD students here. It's getting older. Maybe they're all, but the majority sort of I think so. What does that say?
Yeah. So look, I think there is still an interest amongst our students and the next generation in working for government and in a public service arena, but it's not as strong an interest as it would have been, say, in my generation. And I think that's partly because they have other options, which they might find more appealing and more interesting. It's partly because I think the public service as an institution has been weakened to some extent. It's partly because I think the way in which politics and public policy come together may be less attractive to this generation. And they're coming together in different ways. I mean, I've never had the view that there was this golden age of the past where all governments just thought purely in terms of the national interest, good policy, and sort of the grubby world of politics really intervened. It's never thus. But I think, I think it is the case that our policy making capabilities in Canberra, which is what I'm saying, the same applies in just state governments and policy making state governments is of a different nature and different order. I think they are weak. They have been. I think there are many reasons for that. And over time, that's what the perception is, that the attraction will be less.
Thanks so much, Peter. Just before we finish up, yes, my fellow Executive Council member, the Honourable Colin Forrest, SC, will just make some closing remarks.
Charlie recently joined the council, the Executive Council of the Queensland chapter, and tonight I think is his first time chairing one of our events, and he's done a fantastic job. And Charlie, who was able to wrangle, I suppose is the word to use, Peter and Varghese to speak to us tonight, and that's Charlie's only contribution to the chapter for the year. That's a fantastic one, but I'm sure it won't be. But Peter, that was a terrific talk tonight and very engaging. The fact that we had so many members here and 150 people online.
A lot of questions which we didn't answer, so apologies to the people of the.
And I expect, Peter, that a lot of those online visitors were from interstate as well. So one of our best events for a long time, and the content of it really matched the expectations. So thank you so much for coming along. I said to you before, I know your brother Frank. He used to appear as an expert witness in my court many, many times. The contribution that the Varghese family has made to this Australian community is one that is just beyond exception. So fantastic for all of you. Now, it's my pleasure to also tell you about our next event. It's a special one. We're going to be down at the Queensland Parliamentary Annex Tuesday night, the 23rd of November. We're going there to celebrate 75 years of Australia-Philippines bilateral relations. The event's being hosted by us with the assistance from the Australia-Philippines Business Council, Federation of Filipino Communities in Queensland, and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Australia-Philippines. If you remember, you can buy a ticket and come along for $60, $30 for student members. You can buy these tickets through the AIIA website. There's going to be a Philippines-style barbecue, and we're assured by the Filipinos that there'll be plenty of singing and dancing, as they very much like to party. We need to give the caterers down at Parliament House numbers, an indication of numbers at least by this Friday, this coming Friday. So if you haven't already bought a ticket and you do think you'll come, please get online and buy the tickets before the end of this week. Going to have some good speakers. The Honorary Consul for the Philippines, Margaret Grubbett, will be talking about the history of Filipinos in Queensland and their great contribution to Queensland. Raphael Toda, the Vice President of the Australia-Philippines Business Council, who's going to be talking about the thriving business relationship between Queensland and Philippines. And Professor Caitlin Byrne, who's the Director of the Griffith Asia Institute, who's going to talk about the bilateral relationship today and how Australia and the Philippines work together in the 21st century. So it'll be great to see you all there. And if any of you people online can come along, it'll be great to welcome you there as well in person. Thank you again to Peter and to Charlie for very much.